Sometimes there's aspects of learning. So the younger males actually watch the older males and are probably learning from those situations. You can freely get information, so you can learn so much so fast. And I think that's got to be good for people's appreciation of biodiversity and birds and things.
I'm here today with Dr. John Bates of the Field Museum. Hello, John. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Maybe you could start by talking about your interest in birds. How did you first become interested in birds?
So I'm one of those kids who got interested in birds in an unusual way, I guess, in the sense that my dad was an organic chem professor at the University of Arizona and always loved birds. And my brother was 4 years older than me, and I realized at some point if I wanted to spend any time with the two of them, I better get interested in birds. And so that's how it all started. But because I was growing up in Tucson, Arizona, I had, the birds were incredible in that part of the world. And then my family did a lot of traveling, and so I got to see places like Peru and East Africa and Trinidad and Tobago, and just, again, always liked birds. And when I got into college, I thought I was going to be a pre-med, and then realized somebody might pay me to study birds the rest of my life. And so the rest of that is basically history, because I was able to go get a PhD at Louisiana State University, and then met my wife there, and the two of us did postdocs at the American Museum of Natural History, and then she got an offer at the Field Museum, and they needed another curator of birds at the same time, and they offered us 1.3 positions to come to Chicago to start out, and we've been here for 28 years since.
Yeah. Now, those trips with your family, were those specific birding trips that your father was a part of, or was he on work trips? Or?
So the quick answer to that is sort of. So my mom was not a birder, and the deal in the family was we would do a family trip every other year. My dad convinced her that we could go birding every other year. And my sister and my mom would go with us to Africa and South America. On some other trips, for instance, my dad set up a car trip where we drove down to Palenque on the Guatemalan border with Mexico one year, and just covered as much of Mexico as we could by car. And that was just my brother, my dad and I, and one of my brother's friends.
Did your brother become a scientist as well?
My brother is a medical researcher at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and a very hardcore birder, and currently a member of the ABA's management committee or something.
Do you keep a life book?
So I always laugh at that question, because I used to keep a life list, and then as I got older, my dad actually kept it for me once I got into science, because I would start going to places and I was researching birds, and so I didn't really have time to keep track of my life list. Now with eBird, of course, I put in things, but I actually don't have a lot of lists from some of the early places we went. So my father, after he retired, got really interested in traveling and looking for birds, and by the time he died during COVID, he had seen over 8,000. So he'd been around the world looking at birds.
That's amazing. And how many bird species have been identified worldwide?
Well, I always like to point out to people, that's a good question, because in 1970 or so, the American Ornithological Union said that there were about 9,000 birds and there were no more left to describe. And I always like to emphasize to people that they should remember that, because today there are 10,800, and that number keeps continuing to rise.
Yeah. What was the most recent discovery of a new bird species?
Ooh, good question. Most recent discovery of a new bird species. I should be able to come up with this. The most recent one, there have been some storm petrels that have been described fairly recently. I cannot think of what the...
Storm petrels from like remote islands, or?
Yeah, some of it's, and some of what's happening in those situations is genetic data is showing that breeding populations, that there's a lot of fidelity to breeding populations. So these birds, particularly petrels and shearwaters and albatrosses, for instance, have very strong homing capabilities where they get back to the places they breed. And as a result, there's genetic structure. And a lot of these things have distributions, for instance, that go around the Antarctic Peninsula. So a project that I wasn't involved with, but I know the people that were, involved doing genetic work on gentoo penguins, which occur on the Antarctic Peninsula, South Georgia, the Falkland Islands, and then they also occur in other circumpolar islands in the southern hemisphere. And there were at least 4 genetically distinct units in that study that colleagues of mine that I went to Antarctica with a couple years ago recommended be elevated to species. So there's an Antarctic population of Gen 2 penguins that would be Antarctic Gen 2 penguin, South Georgia Gen 2 penguin, and Falkland Islands Gen 2 penguin.
Nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's genetic data are providing a lot of insight into the evolutionary histories of these animals in ways that have just revolutionized how we think about taxonomy.
Yeah. And what, your field work has taken you all over the world, but where specifically are you researching currently? And what species?
So, yeah, I mean, one of the best things about my job is I'd like to working a lot of places currently because of just the nature of how projects evolve. So we've got a new species of canary that we're working on with a colleague from the coast of East Africa. Just gotten news that we have permits to go sample blood from populations of Falkland Islands penguins, which is something that we're really excited about because we found the researchers that we were with found a ton of genetic structure in Gen 2 penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula, and so we want to know whether the populations in the Falkland Islands are similar. I've got students working on the west coast of Ecuador. We just submitted an NSF grant to look at elevational gradients in recreating some historical work that was done on the same gradients in the Manu National Park region in Peru and also in the Ganga Valley in China.
Nice. When would you be going to some of these places?
Well, it all depends on funding and permits. And in the Falklands case, we're hoping to go in December and spend 3 weeks in the Falklands sampling. We don't know about any of the other things.
Yeah. Well, switching gears here a little bit, I have an interest in leks and Lekking species, and wanted to talk a little bit about the greater prairie chicken and how they are a Lekking bird, an arena bird, if you will. I think of a lek as an arena. I don't know if would you agree with that as?
Yeah, I think that's a good description. I mean, the way I come at it is because I'm not a behavioral biologist, is just thinking that it's evolved in a lot of different lineages of birds, and it basically, from my perspective, involves males finding these display sites where they're literally sitting there doing their thing and trying to attract females for mating, and it happens in a lot of different groups of birds.
Well, before I wanted to talk about the paradox of the lek, but maybe we should talk a little bit more about the greater prairie chicken. Have you seen greater prairie chickens?
Yeah, not very well.
Yeah.
So, and to go to the leks, you have to get up early in the morning, and the distribution of those birds has been reduced dramatically with the changes across the Midwest, and so they're hanging on. They're very closely monitored and managed, and so that's a good thing. But yeah, no, I have not seen one as well as I would have liked.
Yeah, I saw them in the Sandhills of Nebraska, the booming of the males. But so if the paradox of the lek would be, then you have males in this arena doing their calls and dances, and females are congregating around these males, in theory selecting for the best genetics to mate with, right? If that were the case, if the females are all selecting the same male, then the lek breeding system would kind of fall apart, right?
I mean, I think it has a lot to do, maybe, and I think sometimes it turns into this aspect of overall life history strategies where if you're not the alpha male, you're hanging around and hoping to get chances. And across birds, there are lots of different ways in which they do that. You get helpers at nests and things, and so leks are definitely a bizarre aspect of this, and at the same time it's evolved multiple times across the avian tree of life, and so it's clearly something that some of those lineages find, I don't know, useful. And there are various aspects of things. I mean, prairie chickens are interesting in the sense that none of the Lekking species have any male parental care. So you have to have a system where the female can go off and raise the young on her own successfully. And so that's one aspect of this. And that kind of, at some level, frees up the males to start displaying and figuring out which one is going to be most attractive to the females that are coming on to the situation. So yeah, no, I mean, the evolutionary thing on it is, aspects of it are really interesting. And yet again, I you know, the thing to me that always strikes me is how many times it's evolved in hummingbirds, manakins, birds of paradise, prairie chickens, different types of shorebirds. I mean, there's just a lot of different groups that have actually gone that direction.
Sharp-tailed grouse.
Sharp-tailed grouse, for sure.
Yeah. 'Cause they'll often have overlapping breeding sites with greater prairie chickens, right?
Yeah, that's one where I find that really fascinating. I mean, there are hybrids known, and I think one of the problems with, while that's true, it'd be interesting to be able to look at the Great Plains 300, 400 years ago and ask what things were like before humans showed up and actually started pushing them around and destroying habitat and things. And I wonder sometimes how much some of that is predicated on redistribution or movements of the two that have pushed them together at some level.
Yeah. So the within a Lekking community or a Lekking species, there's also another hypothesis, the hotshot hypothesis. I don't know if you want to get into that, but essentially the idea is that you have this male that the females are attracted to, and other males will congregate in this general vicinity in hopes that one of these females will select them being in the vicinity of this other male. Is that?
Yeah, and sometimes there's aspects of learning. So the younger males actually watch the older males and are probably learning from those situations. It's an interesting system, and there's very clear evidence in different species that different percentages of the female population is actually going to be impregnated by the alpha male. At the same time, I think you could make an argument that ought to reduce gene flow, but some of that depends on how long that alpha male's around. And so if it's only 3 or 4 years, which apparently the lifespan of prairie chickens is a lot less than I would have thought, to be honest with you, then that turnover is going to make it genetically feasible to maintain genetic variation in a population, I think.
Do you think that could be applied to humans as well, the hotshot phenomena?
So I'm always a little
anthropomorphizing too much.
And I know that's an interest of yours, and I think it's sure. I mean, you can make analogies in that sense. To an extent, for sure, and I think the differences in the biological world, while we're part of the biological world, at the same time, I think these species are dealing with a lot less baggage in a lot of ways than humans are with respect to things. So if I turn that question back to you, what would you say?
Well, I also think it's quite interesting. I would say that on some levels, but again, we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful with.
I mean, I think the interesting thing is the skewed aspect of the mating system. While I'm sure there are some human societies and some situations where there's definitely skewness in that, it's not what the entire population is doing, like it is in this situation with the prairie chickens or sharp-tailed grouse, or and they're just mesmerizing systems like the various mannequins and some of the things that they do, where and the research is kind of amazing, where they've documented that there's a 15-year-old long-tailed mannequin in Costa Rica that's responsible for 95% of the copulations in the population based on genetic analyses. So that's pretty stunning. And at the same time, around that male, he's always got someone else that's actually displaying with him, another male that's presumably hanging around to learn the ropes from clearly the best male in terms of displaying and attracting females. And so all those processes, just, the idea that they could evolve and basically apply to the whole system is pretty amazing. At the same time, there's a really neat thing with ruffs, where there are males that never achieve male plumage, but just hang around and try to mate with females before they get up to the breeding grounds where the leks are. And so I've always found that to be an example of where clearly in any kind of system like this, there's the possibility of some of the individuals of the sex that's actually doing the displaying, figuring out ways to game the system.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, evolutionary. There's always alternate ways, right? That all species figure out over time.
Yeah, and again, with Lekking, one thing from an evolutionary perspective that I've always found fascinating on this is, like, at what point is there no return? So could birds of paradise actually survive without Lekking? Could you lose Lekking in sharp-tailed grouse or prairie chickens? And sharp-tailed grouse are interesting because they have this much bigger distribution that goes all the way up into the northern parts of the distribution or northern parts of North America. So they're up in tundra, and I've always wondered whether, it sounds like they don't know very much about the breeding biology of those birds, but I wonder if it could be that there just aren't good places for leks in some of that habitat, but I don't know that. And so that's another aspect of all these kinds of behaviors I always wonder about is what forces within the biology of those organisms could potentially, once they've gone that route and are lekking on a regular basis, lead to changes in that. And I don't know. I mean, they're amazing systems. I mean,
yeah, and within the sharp-tailed grouse and greater prairie chicken, what role do you think fighting has, the combat, in these lekking systems with males, male-male combat?
Well, I don't think that there's any doubt that it's a method to see who's king of the hill. And at the same time, it's always interesting to think about that from the perspective of, from an individual basis, it's clear there are winners and losers. And the interesting thing to me biologically is that the implication there is a sense that it's a win to have a winner for the species too. And in this case, it means mating with more females and producing more offspring for the period of time that you're king of the hill. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon.
Because surely some of the losers in these competitive environments are still reproducing.
Yeah, and some of them aren't, and a lot of them aren't. And so how does that factor in? I mean, truth of the matter is, if you look across the lifespan of any bird, if you start from a set of eggs in a nest of a female sharp-tailed grouse, they're going to have chicks that are potentially 50-50 in terms of the sex ratio, and each one of those pools, males and females, only a small percentage is going to survive to adulthood. And so at some level, it's just adding another layer of effects on the lifespan of any given individual in the population. But no, it's again, the lekking systems clearly have some very evolutionary appropriate advantages for the species that do it.
Right, because females are evaluating a lot of things there, not only the fighting, but then the booming or the calling of the males, right? And then in sharp-tails, the dancing.
Yeah, and I'm always interested. I think it's really hard to truly, and we're getting better tools to do some of this stuff. That's one of the reasons why people will keep studying these things, is because we've got better tools to assess essentially what's the female seeing, what's the female choosing, what's their mindset. And if you think about it, one of the reasons why I think they're so fascinating is it is so hard to figure out exactly what these birds are deciding about and thinking about when they come into a lek, for instance, if you're a female.
Yeah, what are those metrics that they're looking for? Yeah.
No, there was some beautiful work with some of the birds of paradise, where folks working with Cornell Lab of Ornithology and National Geographic were getting high-def video, and they set their cameras up at the level of where the female came in, and nobody had ever done that before, and they realized the males had some completely different plumage patterns that you could see from above that nobody had really appreciated from standing there at ground level and watching that.
Oh yeah, that is fascinating.
Yeah, so I think there's
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more we'll learn about that in the next 20 or 30, 40 years.
Yeah, it's something I didn't think about at all. I wonder if prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse, if there's something there as well, where if females are flying and coming down, if they're seeing something different.
Could be. I mean,
But typically there aren't many trees around
no, and
these
so
Lekking sites.
I tend to think they walk into the leks a
Yeah.
lot of times, and so that's one of the, I mean that's another reason why they've been so well studied, is I think that once you figure out where the lek is and you can set up a blind, you can feel somewhat confident that you're actually close to the action and being able to see the things that you want to kind of see.
Mm-hmm.
With the interesting caveat that as soon as mating's done and things, what happens? They disperse, they go off into the grasslands and brush, and there isn't much data on what happens after that.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think the paternity data is still in its infancy, right, with a lot of this stuff?
well, there's a thing where the tools have absolutely revolutionized in the past 20 years, and they just get even better. And so I could see us learning an awful lot about that aspect of things relatively quickly now, because you can do things like you can swab the outside of eggshells and get DNA to definitely genotype the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so you could begin to look at that in a lot of different ways. I mean, there's still these issues with sperm competition, for instance, where you'd actually have to catch the female and do analyses like, you know, draw out sperm and things. So there's always one of the things I like about all of this is there's a level of mystery where the actual aspect of fertilization becomes still really hard to figure out. And one thing I don't understand in looking at the prairie chicken and sharp-tailed grouse literature is I always wonder what possibility there is for sperm storage in the females, and it doesn't sound like they think there's much going on there, but
Yeah,
why not?
right.
I mean, that's...
I think that is one of the exciting things about science, is that we're just, you know, tip of the iceberg trying to figure so many things out here.
Absolutely. And,
Yeah.
and you know, the next study figures out something, and then there's some new technique or somebody thinks of a different way of looking at it as a result of seeing the previous study, and goes out and gathers data in a different way. And then, you know, for all these, you know, these two birds that we're talking about, you know, what's the role of geography? Again, you know, what happens in the tundra of northern Canada and southern Alaska versus down in the prairies of North Dakota and South Dakota? You know, it's just, I always wonder about that.
Yeah. During the course of your field work over the years, have you had any memorable or near-death experiences? Or I think a lot of people have a perception of biologists doing field work, and they may not understand some of the exposure levels or parasites or things that people may encounter while they're working in certain environments.
I wouldn't say that I've had near-death experiences. I've had plenty of situations where if something had gone slightly differently, it could be a lot worse. I was just talking to students about working in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo this morning, and that's a part of the world where there are plenty of people in the areas that we've worked where you wouldn't want to meet them on a trail in the forest. And then I always emphasize, though, you know, so people like, why would you go there? Well, the flip side of it is 90% of the people in that area or more are just trying to make their lives better, and that includes knowing more about the biodiversity around them. So we're working with those folks, and the one thing I've always said about that is that I trust those people because they don't want to have any problems, and when they say leave because they're uncomfortable about what's going on in the area and think we might be in a little bit of danger, then we leave. And so crazy things can happen in those situations for sure, but the idea is to always keep your eyes open. And so I've always, I've been a lot of different places, and the key is just always being aware of what's going on around you. And if you do that, a lot of times you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that are out there.
Have you picked up any parasites or things in the field?
Oh yeah, yeah. I worked as a bird bander in Manaus, Brazil, back in the '80s, and caught something called leishmaniasis, which is a protozoan thing that goes after, lives in lymph cells and can be fatal in some kinds. And it was pretty common in Manaus, Brazil, and I basically had this lesion on my leg and started taking antimony shots, because the only way they knew to treat it was to basically give you a heavy metal that the lice individuals didn't like. And I got most of it done before I had to leave Brazil. And when I got back to the US, the lesions started coming back. And I was all panicked. And my mom worked for the Indian Health Service, and she made a few calls, and it turned out that there was a guy at the University of Arizona who worked on lice and was literally tickled pink to see me when I walked in with this lesion on my leg. He literally pulled this woman, he goes, sit here, and he comes back in with this other doctor, and he points at my leg and he goes, what do you think that is? And she looks at him and she goes, well, if you're standing next to it, it must be leishmaniasis. But that, that ended up going away with some treatments that he gave me where he heated the lesion. And I think the kind of lice that I had would actually have gone away on its own, probably.
But the treatment is still the archaic, injection of heavy metals,
so.
right?
Yeah. And I always tell people that some people have gone into anaphylactic shock, and I actually got these vials from basically the health department in Manaus and went straight back out in the field and started banding birds the rest of the time.
Is it true? I've heard stories about leishmaniasis that it'll go after the cartilage.
So there's a lot of variation in lice, and so there's types of lice that are cutaneous that are really problematic, and then there are others that aren't. And it's a huge area of tropical medical research, and the one I had was not bad. But again, how do you know that when you get it? Well, no, you don't. And so, but the biggest thing about it, I always tell people about those kinds of things, is you always want to be prepared for when you bring it back to the U.S. that the doctors you're dealing with won't have any idea what to do.
Right.
We came back with a gigantic rash on our butts from a trip to Brazil, and one of my colleagues went in, and the doctor he saw was all panicked about it and said it was terrible. The doctor, even though we had an idea what it was, it's a ringworm type thing, and when I went into my doctor, I brought in a whole bunch of papers, and he basically left the room, and to this day I felt like he was probably sitting there Googling what I was saying this was. And he came back out and he said, I have a lot of people that come in and tell me that they have something when they're probably wrong.
Yeah.
He goes, in this case, I don't think you're wrong.
Right.
And you get it treated and you're done.
Yeah.
And then you go on.
I had a doctor Google botfly larva when I told him that's what I thought it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My wife Shannon had one that she got in Costa Rica when we did field work there, and she came back and didn't know what it was, and realized it while she was back in Louisiana, and went into the doctor, and they ended up cutting out this massive cyst and gave it to her because she asked for it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of things that can happen. I'm still amazed at aspects of what the entire world is like, though, for instance, with respect to things like water. So as a kid, I would have said everywhere we ever went, we would get sick and have diarrhea at some point. And nowadays, you would drink bottled water almost anywhere in the world and not probably think about it and probably not get sick.
Yeah.
So it's amazing what humans can accomplish in some of those situations.
Right. Have you done any field work in Australia?
Nope. Never set foot in Asia either.
Well, I did want to talk a little bit about Gouldian finches, which are native to Australia. And they have the 3 color morphs, the red, the black, and the yellow. But the yellowhead is very uncommon, right?
Yeah. So and I don't know whether they've actually. Again, this is a place where tools that exist now become really interesting. So you ought to be able to sequence genomes and begin to look at the genetic variation that's coding for those color variations. And I think that's going to hold some interesting clues into why some of these are rarer than others. But the red morph is supposed to be dominant, and yet it's pretty uncommon. And again, I think, why is that the case? I don't know.
Right.
I mean, maybe it's hard to produce, and there's those kinds of variants are actually somewhat unusual within populations of birds. And yet at the same time, it's reasonable to think that a variant like that could potentially, in the right situation, lead to the subsequent formation of a black-headed Gouldian finch and a red-headed Gouldian finch. And I'd be curious to know whether some of that is present in the genetic ancestry of Gouldian finches.
Yeah. And why do the three morphs still persist today? Even though the yellow is in such a small sliver of the population, but yet it still continues.
Right, and there's some evidence that mating between different morphotypes actually results in reduced nesting success. So that implies to me that there's actually some pretty significant genetic differences that the result of evolution of those plumage traits in allopatry, for instance. But I don't know. And I think, again, we have tools to look at that are just absolutely amazing now. So one of my favorite examples along those lines is there's a manakin in South America called helmeted manakin, which is widespread across the Cerrado of the southern Amazon basin. In the eastern part of the distribution, outside the eastern part of the distribution in a highland area, there's a very small population of a new taxon that was described about 25 years ago or so. And the males in that population, instead of being all black with a red crown, which is what they normally look like, are white-bodied with black wings. And it's called in different species, Antilophia bakermani. And the interesting thing about it is when they looked at it genetically using sort of the standard markers that people can use, like mitochondrial DNA, they found there was almost no genetic divergence between those things. And so what I think is going on there is you've literally got a population that's isolated from its much more broadly distributed sister population. You had a mutation show up with a white body, and because there's sexual selection, all the males in that population have that white body. Now the interesting thing is they're allopatric, so you don't know what would happen if they came together. But one hypothesis would be if it did, the females of the regular helmeted manakin would love those white-bodied black-winged birds, and it would spread across the entire population. But with allopatry, you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could explain what allopatry is, because a lot of people might not.
Yeah, geographically separate from one another. White-bodied, black-winged bakermani helmeted manakins live in a high elevation area that's probably it's only about 40 to 50 kilometers or so probably from populations of helmeted manakins in the adjacent lowlands. And so there's some habitat differences there. But those are things that keep ornithologists up at night, just like the Gouldian finches. I think that there's clearly been a lot of research out in northern Australia where they occur. And again, what aspects of the biology of the birds might impinge on some of those kinds of traits are really interesting.
This may sound like an odd question to ask, but I think we as collective humans, we often think about how things impact our own lives. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how can we get the general population more interested in science and specifically in biology?
Yeah, well, I think about that question all the time. It's hard. It's a hard question because once you've already devoted to it, it's hard to imagine why you wouldn't.
Right.
Why anybody wouldn't be interested in biology. At the same time, I guess from a very personal standpoint, I knew a lot of people growing up who dragged their kids around looking for birds. At some level, that's what happened to me. And so I had no intention of, when we had a baby boy, that I would force him into biology. And he never showed much interest in biology. And the good thing there is he never showed disinterest in biology. Yeah. And so I think that's a good thing. I think there are some situations where if you try to force it on kids as they're growing up, they'll rebel, and they may never gain that interest. I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you know, in the places we've worked around the world, one of the greatest things is how interested people can be. And yet at the same time, you look at what governments do, and I would argue that governments often are very poorly constructed with respect to appreciating biodiversity very well. And that includes, I mean, the U.S. may be one of the primary examples of places where I'd love to see the U.S. government reorganize to actually recognize the value of biodiversity. I've given a few lectures lately where I point out to people that you know, if you look at the federal government and the Department of Interior, what you've got is a bunch of management agencies for managing things so humans can use them, but nothing for biodiversity itself. And I'd love to see more thought put into that so that biodiversity actually has a seat in the table. And there's some interesting things going on. So the country of Ecuador has actually written biodiversity as an entity into their constitution. Now, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to do what I'd like to see happen with biodiversity, which is that it's respected and studied and monitored and preserved everywhere in the world. But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, it's certainly a good precedent, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, you know, I think talking about those kinds of things when there are opportunities and then teaching about it, it's always surprising to me that there could be people not interested in the biological world once you get out into it.
Right. But that's the thing too, right? I think that on some level the biological world impacts every human on the planet, right?
I guess what I would say is the answer to that is yes, but not in ways that they necessarily appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest challenges the world faces right now is with urbanization. You get kids that are growing up in a country like Kenya, but growing up in Nairobi, who've never had a chance to go into a area where there are elephants and zebras and giraffes, even though there's a national park right outside the city of Nairobi. And I worry a lot about that aspect of things. And you know, that's one of the reasons why I love working at a natural history museum, for instance, because we literally bring material from the biological world to people on a regular basis, and some of those people spend a lot of time out in the biological world and appreciate it. Others of them will never see things like that. So, you know, we have a mounted specimen of Bushman, this iconic gorilla that was captive in the Brookfield Zoo and Lincoln Park Zoo. And I love the fact that people see that animal and get a chance to appreciate that, because 99.9% of them will never get to see one in the wild.
Yeah.
And so if that goes a small way to getting them to appreciate, you know, what a gorilla really looks like and how big they are and how majestic they are, that's a good thing. And if that helps preserve forest in Rwanda and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, that's good.
Yeah.
You know, at the same time, I think getting people to travel is obviously another aspect of this, and so you get people interested in nature and they go around more and they want to see more things, and that's a good thing too.
How would you say that your life's work studying birds, how has that impacted your life directly?
Well, I would say I've gotten paid to, one of the ways I say it is I've gotten paid to do my avocation. In other words, I love birds, and so can you say it's work when you're out studying birds? But the truth of the matter is it is work, and to do science, it requires a lot of work, and I think that's another aspect of why sometimes it's hard for people to do it. But for me, I can't imagine a better thing than to be able to go out and try to learn something new about the biology of anything. And birds are a spectacular group, and you can find them everywhere. So you know, even in cities, and there are interesting things about birds living in cities that'll keep scientists busy far into the future. And so the questions never go away. And I think that's the best thing about it. And so for my career, I feel like what I've wanted to do is a couple of things, which is build capacity everywhere we go around the world to appreciate biology, and people don't necessarily have to be biologists to do that, but at the same time, I've recognized that anywhere you go, you need an academic community that actually cares about biodiversity. I think one of my pet peeves is that conservation is amazing. It's important to preserve land. And if you preserve that land and you don't know anything about what's going on with the biodiversity that's on it, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. And from a local standpoint, if you create a national park and that national park is not incorporated into the academic growth of the people around the area to help understand the scientific value of that, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot. And that's not to say that I don't completely appreciate the emphasis these days on indigenous knowledge and things. That's absolutely important and is a great movement. I want to make sure that all these areas have good academic institutions and field stations and things that can help people study and monitor the biodiversity. And so I think that's one of the biggest things I've taken away from doing research around the world, is that the value of local academics cannot be overlooked in terms of preserving biodiversity around the planet.
I'm trying to think, like you said earlier, I think it's hard for us, coming from the world of biology, to even comprehend the idea of someone not being interested in biology. But I mean, how could we get more people engaged in biology? Why should the general public care about birds?
Well, what I would say is that's a good question, and I think the numbers are such that you can never expect 100% of people to care about birds. I just don't think it's in the cards. So can you get a bigger percentage to care? Absolutely, and there are lots of things you can do. And I think one of the biggest things is to make information accessible. And so I think one of the biggest steps forward are things like with the internet. You can Google information about any bird in the world at the drop of a hat for the most part. There are a few paywalls involved, but you can freely get information, so you can learn so much so fast. And I think that's got to be good for people's appreciation of biodiversity and birds and things. I don't know. I mean, I led a bird walk for the Evanston North Shore Bird Club this morning. I do that on Thursdays during spring and fall migration. And that's a little thing, but if I can help one or two people, and one of the things I would emphasize is it doesn't matter how old you are. If you could start getting interested in birds when you're in your 70s. You could start getting introduced to birds when you're in your 40s. I'm always interested in keeping track of some of that. I think there have been times when the demographics of bird watchers, people talk about them as little old ladies with binoculars, right? There's some truth to that when people say it, and yet at the same time, they just did a birding festival in Chicago this past weekend, and one of my graduate students was saying that they did a behind-the-scenes tour at the museum with, I think, a total of about 40 people, and said that the average age was in their 40s. And I start feeling really good about that, because that implies that there's a bunch of young people likely to have families, they get interested in birds, likely to include their kids in that. And so you start building that next generation, and you see that all the time. And I mean, in academia, we're bringing on the next generation of museum curators here at the Field Museum, and that's exciting. And so, from my perspective, what you do at that point is everything you can to make sure that those people are treated the way they should be treated in order to keep them moving forward in the field. And there are always different ways to do that, whether it's just a hallway conversation or whether it's actually advice on some aspect of career development or things. I mean, there are just lots of ways in which you can get people more engaged. And again, one of the things that always sticks in my mind is it can be as unusual as your son's girlfriend actually texting a picture of a migrant warbler that she saw on the sidewalk the other day. And the fact that she's gotten to know us made her actually look at that and take a picture of it. Well, that's a Tennessee warbler, and that's how it can start.
Right, yeah. It is interesting what can spark someone's interest, yeah.
And I don't think you can anticipate that. And so, you know, that's one of the things about this museum, for instance, is I'm always fond of saying that if you look at a tour guide for the Field Museum, they'll say it's an incredible place, but less than 1% of the specimens are on display. Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean that the other 99% are off limits to people. I mean, we're doing all kinds of stuff associated with digitizing specimens, and we do behind the scenes tours all the time. And the whole point of that is to get people to understand what's here so that they value it, and so that it gets valued into the future, such that the collections continue to be what they need to be. They need to continue to grow, because there are lots of questions that you can ask with newer specimens, comparing them to older specimens. And so, you know, all that stuff is about taking the opportunities to not be sort of shuttered in your office writing papers, but getting out there and engaging people when people have questions, because people always do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we...
So what's your next book going to be about?
I don't know yet. Not sure. I don't know if I want to write another book. Can't say it was a pleasurable experience. It was drudgery, but you know, happy it was done.
Good.
I don't know, why do they call it life sciences now instead of zoology?
Because somebody thought that would be a good thing to shake things up. And I would say I don't know. Sometimes people come into administration who look around and say, well, those are old-fashioned names.
Mm-hmm. But it's old-fashioned, but it's applicable.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's applicable, and I would also say that
it's more correct.
Yeah, and does that combine it from a position standpoint relative to anthropology or what are they called? Cultural sciences, I think, maybe, is that what it is? And earth sciences, which also got changed, but at least didn't get combined between two things that had been separate for many years.
All right, John, well, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Yeah,
And
thanks for coming in.
hopefully we'll do it again.
Anytime.